Psychoanalysis, science, and egregores is the topic that I wanted to discuss in this video, and we're going to be doing a close reading of the chapter Psychoanalysis and Science in the Lacanian Subject Between Language and Jouissance, Bruce Fink book. I've done a couple of videos reviewing some of the chapters of this book, and I wanted to explore the relationship between psychoanalysis and science and posit to you that science or scientism is itself an egregore. It is a collective thought form. It is a network of linguistic relationships that structure and organize human relations, right? So, and it's gonna make maybe more sense as we read on here a little bit. So the idea, what is the relationship between psychoanalysis and science, specifically Lacanian psychoanalysis? And I think it's fascinating and illuminates maybe the structure and function, the psychic and social structure and function of egregores, of how they operate through people, right? So he says here, so the science is discourse. The fact remains, he says, that science is a discourse. So think of the word discourse as egregore. You can use them interchangeably for this little thought experience, thought experiment here. So the fact remains that science is an egregore. As banal as that statement may seem, it implies a dethroning of science and a reassessment of science as one discourse among many. Freud may be interpreted as translating quote-unquote rationality into rationalization, and Lacan's discourse theory, egregore theory, suggests that there are as many different claims to rationality as there are different discourses. Each discourse, each egregore, seeking its own ends and having its own mainspring, attempts to make its own form of rationality prevail. So in the chapter previous to this chapter is entitled The Four Discourses. So the four egregores, right? The four discourses that Lacan elaborates are the master's discourse, the university discourse, the hysterics discourse, and the analyst discourse. And these are, they function historically in the master's discourse, or the initial egregore I would situate it back with the creation of the modern subject, right? With Descartes, I think, therefore I am, which created this split subject, as Lacan would put it, where our conscious and unconscious kind of forked, right? And actually created the unconscious at that time, right? So that's when the initial egregore got its foothold, because what inaugurated the beginning of the scientific revolution in terms of modernity and also scientism was this reification of rationality, this worship of rationality. And it's irrational. So it's the irrational emergence of the worship of rationality, which has led to the historical reproduction of different egregores through different times. And these four major egregores, again, that were you can explore. These four discourses are available. You can look online if you're interested to kind of get an idea. But it's an egregore, or a discourse, is the structure and function of relationships between human beings and institutions that is organized by this fundamental linguistic organizing matrix or principle or discourse, right? So the master's discourse is the initial one. But let me continue here, and we'll try to elaborate as we go. There are no doubt several presently existing forms of scientific discourse, some of which, the worst, can be subsumed under the university discourse discussed in the last chapter. Science as a justification for and means to further expand the master's power. Some under the hysterics discourse, and so on. So the way that the master's discourse operates is it's power for the sake of power, right? It is the master-slave dialectic as explicated in Hegel. And in the relationship between the master and the slave, the object, the relationship between the truth and the production of knowledge, all of these are considerations in each discourse that relate with each other. So you have the agent, the arena, the other. So you have the agent, the arena, you have the truth, but it's a dissimulated truth, and you have what's being produced. So you have agent, arena, truth, and what's being produced. These are structured in each discourse differently and how they relate to each other. So I'll move on a little here. So One useful way of understanding the relationship between psychoanalytic discourse and scientific discourse is, it seems to me, in terms of Lacan's contribution to discourse theory in the 70s, starting in Seminar 21. Before turning to it, however, let me briefly sketch out his approach to the relationship between psychoanalysis and science in the mid-1960s. And this is where I think it gets interesting. The thought experiment gets a little interesting. So it's entitled Suturing the Subject. So let's read a little bit here. So Lacan, quite interested at the time in establishing psychoanalysis as a science, poses the question as follows. Do all presently existing scientific discourses have something in common? I've already discussed his answer to this question elsewhere in a commentary on Science and Truth, and will summarize it very briefly here. Science, quote-unquote, sutures the subject. That is, neglects the subject, excluding the latter from its field. So this is the interesting concept of suture. And the contention that I'm putting forth is that the egregore, the idol that got a foothold through the reification of rationality, and it's worked itself through the reification of power, which turned into the worship of knowledge, right? Worship of power turned into the worship of knowledge. All that has been a symptom of the parasitology of the egregore getting its foothold into the human realm when this happened initially. And this idea of sutured subject is the kind of final event where the subject, the human being, is sutured out of the symbolic field itself, right? And science does this. He says science sutures the subject, so the scientist is not supposed to be interested in is supposed to be objectively comported towards his field of study. So he removes himself, and in doing so, this sutures the subject, and this is something that he's trying to put forth here. He says, at least it attempts to do so to the fullest extent possible, never fully succeeding. This is as true of Levi Strauss' brand of structuralism as of Newtonian physics. The speaking subject is considered irrelevant to the field. While Lacan was at first excited by the prospect of founding psychoanalysis as a science on basis similar to those of linguistics and structural anthropology, he later distinguished psychoanalysis from the latter two disciplines, in that they do not take truth into account, the cause, and thus the subject that will have resulted from the cause. If science can be said to deal with truth, it is only insofar as it reduces truth to a kind of value. It made me think of the reign of quantity, right? And it made me think of the correspondence theory of truth that Heidegger critiques, right? If science can be said to deal with the truth, it is only insofar as it reduces truth to a kind of value. In truth tables, the letters T, true and false, are assigned to various possible combinations of propositions. I assert that Lacan was French. You get some examples here. So, science relies on the designations true and false, but they take on meaning only within a propositional or symbolic logic. They are values understandable within the field defined by that science and make no claims to independent validity. Quote-unquote true and false are thus simply values in scientific discourse, like plus and minus, 0 and 1. They are binary opposites that play a role in a specific context. Truth with a capital T, on the other hand, is swept aside, relegated to other disciplines, whether poetry, literature, religion, or philosophy. Psychoanalysis, he says, this is the Fink book again, Bruce Fink's book, Lacanian Subject. Psychoanalysis, by contrast, gives precedence to that which throws into question the self-confirming nature of its own axioms. So psychoanalysis gives precedence to that, and this is what differentiates it from the hard sciences, right? It gives precedence to that which throws into question the self-confirming nature of its own axioms, right? That is pride, right? It's questioning pride in a psychoanalytic sense, right? The self-confirming nature of its own axioms. The real, the impossible, that which does not work. So that's what psychoanalysis is interested in. The real, the impossible, that which does not work. If we can think of what works in this world, right? This world is a fallen world. The symbolic order is a fallen order. So the smooth functioning of the symbolic order is the problem in a sense, right? And when it stops functioning, that's what happens when that stops functioning is what psychoanalysis is interested in, right? It's because it gives precedence to that which throws into question the self-confirming nature of its own axioms. That is the truth taken responsibility for in psychoanalysis. The major form it takes is the impossibility of sexual relationships. That's a whole other area here. If science can be said to deal with the subject, it is only the conscious Cartesian subject, master of its own thoughts, whose thought is correlative to its being. Existing sciences certainly do not take into account the split subject for whom, quote, I am, where I am not thinking, and I think, where I am not. Science, America's foremost de facto metalanguage, sutures the Lacanian subject, suturing its cause as truth in the same gesture. As it excludes the psychoanalytic subject and object, Lacan's view in the 1960s is that science will have to undergo some serious changes before psychoanalysis can be included within its scope. In other words, the formation of psychoanalysis into math themes and rigorously defined clinical structures, so characteristic of Lacan's work at that stage, does not suffice to make psychoanalysis into a science, for science itself is not yet capable of encompassing psychoanalysis. Science must first come to grips with the specificity of the psychoanalytic object. At that time, then, Lacan's view is that the science is not yet equal to the task of accommodating psychoanalysis. In Seminar 10, Lacan associates the supposed progress of science with our increasing inability to think the category cause. Continually filling in the gap between cause and effect, science progressively eliminates the content of the concept cause, events being understood as leading smoothly in accordance with well-known laws to other events. Lacan understands cause in a more radical sense, as that which disrupts the smooth functioning of law-like interactions. Think of a totalitarian system, right? So cause is a more radical sense is that which disrupts the smooth functioning of law-like interactions, this totalizing system and function of the law, this autonomic or autocratic system, this machinic system that just runs, right? When it breaks down, that's when there's an incursion from the real, right? We'll have to get into the three registers. I have another couple videos going over the three registers, but let's focus a little bit more on the reading here, and I won't make this too long. Causality in science is absorbed into what we might call structure, cause leading to effect within an ever more exhaustive set of laws. A cause is something that seems not to obey laws, remaining inexplicable from the standpoint of scientific knowledge, has become unthinkable, our general tendency being to assume that it will just be a matter of time before science can explain it. What distinguishes psychoanalysis from the sciences is that it takes into account the cause and the subject in his or her libidinal relation to the cause. Libidinal relation to the cause. Whereas linguistics, for example, takes the subject into account only as determined by the symbolic order, that is, by the signifier. Psychoanalysis, thus, grapples with the two faces of the subject. One, the pure subject, the combinatory or matrix, the subject without cause, as it were, and the sutured, saturated subject, as Lacan calls it, that is, the subject in relation to an object of jouissance, a libidinal object, the subject as a stance adopted with respect to jouissance. So these terms I would, in the light of the egregore, right, or of the idol. So the idea of the libidinal object is the thing that inflames the passions. And the economy of the passions, from an orthodox perspective, right, that which we are passive against, that works through us, right, is explicated, I would say, here, or related to the idea of jouissance. Jouissance is translated to enjoyment. It literally means little death, and it is the main function of the egregore and how it interacts with the human realm, I would say, in this thought experiment. The project of Lacanian psychoanalysis in the 1960s to maintain and further explore these two primordial concepts, cause and subject, however paradoxically they may seem. At this stage in Lacan's work, the differences between science and psychoanalysis seem altogether insurmountable. This situation changes to some extent when Lacan identifies true scientific discourse with the hysterics discourse, as I mentioned in the last chapter. Again, the hysterics discourse is another one of these major egregores, these four that Lacan discusses. For genuine scientific work does not exclude the cause as that which interrupts the smooth function of law-like activity, but rather attempts to take it into account in some way, as in the case of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Here, the real up against which science runs is not neatly skirted, but rather brought within the theory it upsets. Truth, as the encounter with the real, is not elated, but met head-on. The physicist here might be said to allow him or herself to be duped, to work as something other than the knowing subject. In that sense, scientific discourse and the hysterics discourse coincide. But where does that leave psychoanalysis? Psychoanalytic discourse, as operative in the analytic setting, is clearly distinct from the hysterics discourse and is not involved in theory building, but rather in praxis defined by specifically psychoanalytic ends, based on the analyst's enigmatic desire. Psychoanalysis aims at subjectification, separation, traversing the fantasy, and so on. It is not a practice based on understanding, either for the analyst or the analysand, but rather on a certain efficiency, in Aristotle's sense of the term. Psychoanalytic discourse as operative in theory building, on the other hand, insofar as it takes truth seriously, attempting to formulate the encounter with the real, functions much like the hysterics discourse and thus like scientific discourse. It seems to me just as it is important, even though it involves oversimplification, to distinguish basic science from applied science, that is goal-oriented science, it is important to distinguish the strictly theoretical form from the clinical aspects of psychoanalysis. So I'm going to leave it here. I'll make another part to this video here, but I just wanted to introduce the topic and the exploration of this idea of psychoanalysis, science, and egregores. So until next time, I will see you guys.